In the final days of World War II, Nazi officers drove trucks through the Austrian Alps to a remote lake surrounded by mountains. They worked through the night, throwing wooden crates into the black water. Witnesses were warned to stay silent. Some who asked questions were never seen again. For 80 years, Lake Toplitz has refused to surrender what the Nazis hid in its depths. The water drops over 300 feet into absolute darkness. A layer of sunken logs creates a false bottom that has trapped divers and equipment. The lake has no oxygen below 60 feet. It preserves everything and forgives nothing. Multiple people have died trying to reach the bottom. The few expeditions that succeeded found something unexpected. Millions of British pounds. All counterfeit. All perfect. But the money wasn't the horror. The horror was who made it. When investigators traced the origin of those forgeries, they uncovered one of the darkest operations of the Third Reich. The forgers were not Nazis. They were concentration camp prisoners, and most of them were murdered before the war ended. Lake Toplitz sits in the Salzkammergut region of the Austrian Alps, surrounded by limestone peaks and dense evergreen forest. The nearest towns are small, the roads narrow and winding. Even today, reaching the lake requires deliberate effort. In 1945, it was one of the most isolated locations in Central Europe. The geography made it perfect for hiding things that needed to stay hidden. The lake itself is unusual. Roughly a mile long and a few hundred yards wide, it occupies a deep glacial trough carved into the mountains. The surface appears peaceful, reflecting the peaks and forest like a mirror. But that calm surface conceals water that drops over 300 feet into darkness. The lake is meromictic, meaning its layers do not mix. The top 20 meters contain oxygen and support life. Below that, the water becomes anoxic. Nothing breathes in the depths. Nothing decays normally. Objects that sink into the lower layers enter a kind of preservation that the surface world cannot match. More dangerous than the depth is what floats between the surface and the bottom. Centuries of fallen trees have accumulated in the water, creating a submerged lattice of logs at varying levels. This false bottom shifts and settles unpredictably. Gaps that exist one year close the next. The timber creates a maze with no reliable paths through it. In the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. American and British forces pushed from the west. Soviet armies advanced from the east. Germany's thousand-year empire had lasted 12 years and was entering its final weeks. Nazi officials understood what was coming. Surrender meant trials. Trials meant evidence. Evidence meant hanging. Across Germany and occupied territories, the regime began destroying documentation. Files burned in government buildings. Records disappeared from military installations. Witnesses to atrocities were executed before they could testify. The Nazis were methodical about many things, including the elimination of proof, but some evidence couldn't burn. Metal does not catch fire. Certain materials resist destruction. Some secrets were too heavy to carry and too dangerous to leave behind. In late April and early May of 1945, trucks began arriving at Lake Toplitz. Eyewitnesses in the surrounding villages reported convoys moving at night, headlights dimmed, SS officers supervising the operations. The trucks carried wooden crates of various sizes. Local civilians were ordered to remain indoors. Those who watched from windows saw soldiers unloading the crates and throwing them into the water. The work continued for several nights. Then the trucks stopped coming. The soldiers disappeared. The war ended days later. What went into those crates? The men who loaded them weren't talking. Many were dead within weeks, killed in the final fighting or executed to ensure silence. The few who survived scattered across Europe, changed their names, and buried their memories along with their uniforms. Rumors filled the vacuum almost immediately. Nazi gold, looted from conquered nations. Secret weapons too advanced to let the Allies capture. Documents that could implicate powerful people who planned to survive the war and prosper afterward. The lake kept its secrets. The water was too deep, too cold, too hostile for the technology of the era. Whatever the Nazis had hidden would stay hidden until someone found a way to reach it. Lake Toplitz is not merely deep, it is hostile to human exploration in ways that most bodies of water are not. The lake seems designed to keep its secrets, and it has defended them with lethal effectiveness for 8 decades. The surface layer appears inviting, clear alpine water, cold but tolerable for experienced divers. Visibility is excellent in the upper 20 meters. Sunlight penetrates, illuminating rocky walls and the occasional fish. A diver descending into toplets might initially wonder what all the warnings were about. Below 20 meters, everything changes. The water becomes anoxic. No oxygen exists in the lower layers. The transition is invisible but absolute. Divers report sudden disorientation as they cross the boundary, a sensation of wrongness that experienced professionals learn to recognize as a warning. The anoxic layer also contains hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas that accumulates in oxygen-depleted water. In high concentrations, it can incapacitate a diver before they realize anything is wrong. But the chemistry is not the primary killer. The logs are. Centuries of trees have fallen from the steep slopes surrounding the lake. They tumble into the water, become waterlogged, and sink to various depths where they settle into a chaotic lattice. This false bottom spans much of the lake at depths ranging from 30 to 70 meters. The logs create a maze of gaps and openings, some large enough for a diver to pass through, others barely wide enough for equipment. The problem is that the maze changes. Logs shift as divers disturb them. An opening that existed on the descent may close on the ascent. A diver who penetrates the timber layer to reach the true bottom must find their way back through a structure that has rearranged itself around them. In the darkness, with limited air, that navigation becomes nearly impossible. The lake began claiming lives almost immediately after the war ended. In 1946, the first documented fatality occurred when a treasure hunter descended and never surfaced. His body was never recovered. Throughout the 1950s, as rumors of Nazi gold attracted adventurers, more deaths followed. The Austrian government eventually restricted access, but determined divers found ways around the regulations. Each year brought new attempts. Too many brought new casualties. In 1959, a German magazine funded the first major salvage operation. Professional divers with the best available equipment descended into toplets, navigating the log layer with extreme caution. They reached crates resting at intermediate depths, not the true bottom, but deep enough to contain significant finds. What they pulled from the water was unexpected. They pulled up stacks of British banknotes, bundles wrapped in waterproof material and preserved almost perfectly by the anoxic conditions. The divers had found money, millions of pounds sterling. But examination revealed the truth. The notes were forgeries. Extremely high-quality counterfeits, nearly indistinguishable from genuine British currency, but fake nonetheless. Every pound was worthless. The discovery answered nothing and raised new questions. Why would the Nazis dump counterfeit money? What purpose did fake currency serve? Who had produced forgeries of such remarkable quality? The expedition could not reach the deepest portions of the lake. The log layer defeated their attempts to penetrate further. Whatever else rested on the true bottom remained inaccessible. The divers surfaced with crates of worthless paper and a mystery that had only deepened. The lake had surrendered evidence of something, but the explanation for that evidence lay elsewhere, in documents and testimonies that would take years to assemble. The counterfeit pounds pulled from Lake Toplitz were not ordinary forgeries. They were not the work of criminals seeking profit or opportunists exploiting wartime chaos. They were products of one of the most cynical operations ever conceived by the Third Reich, Operation Bernhard. Named after SS Major Bernhard Kruger, the officer who oversaw its execution. The concept was simple in its cruelty. Flood the British economy with counterfeit currency so perfect that banks could not distinguish it from genuine notes. Destabilize the pound sterling, undermine confidence in British financial systems, fund Nazi intelligence operations with money that cost nothing to produce. Economic warfare waged with paper and ink. The Nazis understood that such forgeries required exceptional skill. Master engravers, expert printers, specialists who understood the chemistry of inks and the mechanics of industrial presses. Germany had such experts, but not enough for the scale Kruger envisioned. The solution was characteristic of Nazi logic. Use prisoners, specifically use Jewish prisoners whose skills made them temporarily valuable and whose deaths could be arranged whenever convenient. Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin. Block 19 was isolated from the rest of the facility by fences and guards. Approximately 140 Jewish prisoners were selected from camps across the Reich based on their professional backgrounds. Printers, engravers, graphic artists, bankers who understood currency security features, photographers who could replicate intricate details. They were given an impossible choice, though it was never framed as a choice. Produce perfect forgeries of British 5, 10, 20, and 50-pound notes, or return to the general camp population. Everyone understood what that meant. The gas chambers, the firing squads, the slow death of starvation and disease that claimed thousands daily. The prisoners of Block 19 received better food than other inmates. They slept in real beds. They were not beaten randomly. These privileges were not kindness. They were maintenance. Skilled hands do not work well when starving. Traumatized minds make mistakes. The Nazis needed precision, so they provided the minimum conditions necessary to achieve it. Under constant surveillance and relentless pressure, the prisoners succeeded beyond what anyone expected. They reverse-engineered British security features that had taken the Bank of England decades to develop. They replicated watermarks, paper composition, and printing techniques with painstaking accuracy. They produced notes so perfect that British intelligence struggled to identify them even when specifically looking for counterfeits. Over the course of the operation, the prisoners manufactured approximately £130 million in forged currency. It was the largest counterfeiting operation in history, staffed entirely by men who would be murdered if their work failed and might be murdered when it succeeded. Some of the currency entered circulation. Nazi agents used it to purchase intelligence, bribe officials, and fund operations across neutral countries. The economic destabilization never reached the scale Kruger imagined, but the forgeries caused genuine damage to British financial confidence. As the war entered its final months, the prisoners became a problem. They were witnesses. They knew the details of the operation, the techniques employed, and the names of officers involved. Living witnesses were liabilities in a collapsing regime. The prisoners were transferred from Sachsenhausen as Soviet forces approached. They moved from camp to camp, always ahead of the advancing front, always uncertain whether the next destination would be liberation or execution. Some SS officers advocated killing them immediately. Others hesitated, perhaps hoping the prisoners might prove useful as bargaining chips. In the chaos, some survived. Luck, timing, the intervention of individual guards, the speed of Allied advances. Fewer than 100 of the original 140 lived to see the war end. The printing equipment, the engraving plates, the remaining currency, the documentation of the operation, all of it was loaded onto trucks and driven to a remote alpine lake. The evidence of the crime was thrown into water deep enough to hide it forever. The prisoners had forged the instruments of their own potential death sentences. The lake swallowed the proof. For decades after the 1959 expedition, Lake Toplitz remained largely undisturbed. The Austrian government maintained restrictions on diving. The deaths had created legal liability and international attention that officials preferred to avoid. Occasional unauthorized attempts occurred, some ending in tragedy, but no systematic exploration reached the true bottom. The counterfeit currency sat in museums and archives. Operation Bernhard entered the historical record. The story seemed complete enough. The Nazis had dumped fake money. The prisoners who made it had mostly been murdered. The war was over. What more was there to learn? The lake knew the answer, it just was not telling. Technology eventually provided what human divers could not safely achieve. Remotely operated vehicles, machines that could descend into hostile environments without risking human life, advanced significantly through the 1980s and the 1990s. By the early 2000s, remotely operated vehicles existed that could navigate the complexities of Toplitz. Machines capable of penetrating the log layer and reaching depths where human divers had died attempting to go. Technology had changed the equation. In 2000, CBS News funded an expedition using state-of-the-art underwater drones. The network was producing a documentary about Nazi secrets and saw Toplitz as the centerpiece. Austrian authorities granted permission for scientific exploration under strict supervision. The equipment was deployed from boats positioned over the deepest sections of the lake. The expedition was underway. The remotely operated vehicles descended through the clear upper layer, past the anoxic boundary where the water turned hostile, into the maze of sunken timber that had defeated so many previous attempts. Operators on the surface guided the machines through gaps in the logs, using cameras and lights to navigate spaces that would have killed human divers. Below the false bottom, the true lakebed appeared on monitors for the first time in detailed footage. What the cameras revealed exceeded expectations. The debris field scattered across the bottom was extensive. Wooden crates in various states of decay, metal containers corroded but intact, objects half buried in silt that had accumulated over decades. The Nazis had not dumped a few boxes. They had dumped a substantial operation's worth of evidence. Some crates had broken open, spilling contents across the lake floor. More counterfeit currency confirming the 1959 findings, but also printing plates, the original engravings used to produce the forgeries. These plates were proof of the operation's industrial scale, physical evidence that could be examined and authenticated beyond any dispute. The plates were decisive. The remotely operated vehicles found weapons as well. Small arms, munitions. Components that experts later identified as parts from V-2 rockets, consistent with Nazi weapons research programs. The lake had apparently served as a dumping ground for multiple categories of sensitive material, not just the counterfeiting operation. Document containers appeared on the footage, some still sealed after more than half a century underwater. The anoxic conditions that made the lake so dangerous for divers had also preserved paper that would have disintegrated in normal water. Whatever those documents contained had potentially survived intact. The records might still be there. The cameras captured images of personal effects scattered among the debris, items that likely belonged to the prisoners who had operated the printing equipment. Small objects represented individual human beings caught in machinery designed to exploit and then destroy them. The expedition recovered what it could reach safely. Crates were brought to the surface, their contents cataloged and preserved. But the operators recognized that their work had only scratched the surface. The debris field extended further than the remotely operated vehicles could explore in the time available. The deepest portions remained untouched. Lake Toplitz had surrendered more secrets. It was still keeping others. The artifacts recovered from Lake Toplitz are not historical curiosities. They are evidence of crimes that the Third Reich attempted to erase from existence. Each object pulled from the depths represents a fragment of a story that powerful people wanted permanently buried. The counterfeit currency confirmed Operation Bernhard beyond any reasonable dispute. The sheer volume of recovered notes demonstrated the scale of production. The quality of the forgeries, still remarkable after decades underwater, testified to the skill of the prisoners forced to create them. British experts who examined the recovered notes confirmed that many would have passed inspection at banks during the war. The operation had been devastatingly effective. The printing plates provided even more definitive proof. These were the original engravings used to produce the forgeries, metal surfaces etched with the intricate details of British currency. Possessing such plates was irrefutable proof of industrial counterfeiting. The Nazis had dumped them specifically because they were too damning to leave behind and too durable to destroy. Documents recovered from sealed containers underwent careful restoration. The anoxic water had preserved paper that would have disintegrated in normal conditions. Page by page, researchers pieced together operational details of the counterfeiting program. Names of officers involved, production schedules, distribution networks, the bureaucratic machinery of economic warfare laid out in memoranda and reports. But the evidence also illuminated what remained missing. Since 1945, rumors have persisted that Nazi gold lies at the bottom of Lake Toplitz. The theory has obvious appeal. The Reich looted enormous wealth from conquered nations and from murdered populations. Central bank reserves were seized. Jewelry was stripped from Holocaust victims. Precious metals accumulated through years of systematic theft, and as the war ended, this wealth had to go somewhere. Some was captured by Allied forces. Some was smuggled to South America. Some, the theory suggests, was dumped into lakes too deep to search. No gold has been recovered from Toplitz in any documented expedition. Skeptics point to that absence as proof the rumors are fantasy, treasure hunting mythology attached to a site with genuine historical significance but no precious metals. The counter-argument is straightforward. The deepest portions of the lake have never been fully explored. The most valuable cargo would logically have been dumped in the most inaccessible locations, furthest from shore, below the thickest sections of the submerged log layer. Magnetometer surveys have detected metallic masses at extreme depth. Their composition remains unknown. The Austrian government has neither confirmed nor denied what might rest in the unexplored zones. More troubling than the gold question is the document controversy. Some researchers believe Toplitz contains Nazi records that implicate people who survived the war and later prospered. Those records could include lists of collaborators in neutral countries, financial transaction records showing which banks and businesses profited from the Reich, and intelligence networks that continued operating after 1945. The post-war period saw numerous former Nazis integrate into Western governments, corporations, and intelligence agencies. Documents proving wartime collaboration would have been enormously damaging to individuals and institutions that preferred their histories forgotten. Several recovered documents remain classified or access restricted by Austrian authorities. The justification offered is sensitivity and ongoing relevance, but critics ask a pointed question. What information requires protection 80 years after the war ended? Whose reputations still need defending? The lake preserved what the Nazis wanted destroyed. Every crate dumped was intended to eliminate evidence of crimes. Every splash in the night water was meant to create silence. The prisoners of Block 19 who survived carried their trauma for lifetimes. Most refused to speak publicly about what they had experienced. The men who exploited them attempted to drown the proof alongside the products. The water refused to cooperate. The anoxic depths preserved instead of destroyed. The evidence waited in darkness for technology capable of retrieving it. The Nazis failed to erase their crimes. The lake became an archive instead of a grave for truth. Lake Toplitz has surrendered fragments of its secrets. The counterfeit currency is documented. Operation Bernhard is no longer hidden history. The prisoners who were forced to forge their way to temporary survival have been remembered, their stories recorded before the last of them died. But the lake has not surrendered everything. The complete inventory of what the Nazis dumped in those final desperate nights remains unknown. Every expedition has been limited by technology, funding, time, and by the sheer hostility of the environment. Researchers estimate that less than half of the lake bottom has been systematically explored. The deepest sections, the areas furthest from shore, the zones where the log layer is most impenetrable, these remain essentially unexplored. Theories about what might still rest in those depths range from the plausible to the fantastical. Gold remains the most persistent speculation. The Reich did accumulate enormous wealth through conquest and murder, including central bank reserves from occupied nations, currency, and jewelry confiscated from Holocaust victims. Precious metals were stockpiled for a war effort that consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. Some of this wealth was recovered by Allied forces. Some funded escape routes for fleeing Nazis. Some, according to persistent rumors, was hidden in locations too remote or too dangerous to search. Toplitz fits the profile. It is deep enough to discourage recovery, remote enough to avoid casual discovery, and it remained under Nazi control until the final days. If officers were going to hide wealth they hoped to retrieve after the war, this lake would have been an obvious choice. Holocaust documentation represents another category of speculation. The Nazis kept meticulous records of their atrocities, then attempted to destroy those records as defeat approached. Some archives were captured intact, others were burned. Researchers believe some records may have been dumped in lakes and rivers when burning was not fast enough. Lists of victims, transport manifests, and financial records showing where confiscated property went would have enormous historical value, filling gaps in the record of genocide. They might also implicate institutions and individuals who profited from the Holocaust and escaped accountability. The ethical questions surrounding further exploration have no simple answers. Some argue that every artifact should be recovered. Historical documentation demands complete evidence. The victims deserve full acknowledgement of what was done to them. Hidden truths should be exposed regardless of who they implicate or what uncomfortable questions they raise. The technology exists to reach the bottom safely now. The only obstacles are funding and political will. Others contend the lake should remain undisturbed. Further exploration risks more deaths despite technological advances. Equipment failures happen. Accidents occur. The log layer remains treacherous even for machines. The recovered evidence is sufficient to document the crimes. Some secrets are buried for reasons that may still matter, and disturbing them serves no purpose beyond satisfying curiosity. The Austrian government has maintained a middle position for decades. Limited scientific expeditions are permitted under strict supervision. Treasure hunting is prohibited. Commercial salvage is forbidden. The balance between historical inquiry and respect for a site connected to mass murder remains official policy, though critics on both sides find it unsatisfying. The survivors of Operation Bernhard are gone now. Adolf Berger, one of the prisoner forgers, lived until 2016. He wrote about his experiences, consulted on a film adaptation of the story, and spent his final decades ensuring that the world remembered what happened in Block 19. He described the impossible position the prisoners occupied with clarity that official documents could never capture. Their skills kept them alive while creating evidence that made them targets for elimination. They forged their survival one note at a time, never knowing if the next day would bring liberation or execution. Berger and his fellow survivors carried their trauma for 7 decades. Most never spoke publicly. The few who did wanted the world to understand something that the recovered crates and currency could only partially convey. The forgeries were not just paper. They were hours of forced labor by men who understood they were working toward their own deaths. The lake preserved the products of that labor. The human cost exists only in memory now, and memory fades with each generation. What remains in Toplitz may answer historical questions. It cannot restore what was taken from the men who created its contents. Lake Toplitz sits in the Austrian Alps, surrounded by peaks that have watched empires rise and fall for millennia. The water is calm at the surface, reflecting mountains and forest with perfect clarity. Beneath that mirror lies darkness that has resisted 8 decades of inquiry. Somewhere in that darkness, crates still rest on the silt. Some have broken open, their contents scattered across the lake bed. Others remain sealed, preserving whatever the Nazis placed inside them on those final desperate nights in 1945. The men who loaded the trucks are dead. The officers who gave the orders are dead. The prisoners who created the counterfeit currency, who forged their temporary survival one banknote at a time, are dead. The witnesses who might have explained everything were silenced before the war ended or took their secrets to natural graves decades later. What remains is water and evidence, proof of one crime documented, suggestions of others still submerged. The Nazis wanted the truth to disappear forever. The lake has partially obliged, holding secrets in anoxic depths where human divers cannot safely go, and machines have only begun to explore. Every expedition recovers fragments. Every fragment raises new questions. The complete truth may rest beyond recovery now, too deep and too dangerous to reach. But the lake remembers what was given to it, and somewhere beneath the false bottom of sunken trees, the evidence waits. Patient, preserved, silent.